Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. This is a Conservative Home fringe event in partnership with Raytheon UK, a technology and innovation leader who invests in the UK's workforce and technological development. We're very fortunate that despite everything that's happened this year, we're able to do this event. Last year, at the previous Conservative conference, I sat down for an in-depth conversation with Ben Wallace, the Secretary of State for Defence, and he's very kindly agreed to join us again this year, 12 months on, to see how things have been coming along. It's fair to say, particularly at the Ministry of Defence, I think you always engage in relatively turbulent times in a challenging world. So thank you very much for joining us, Ben.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
So without further ado, I suppose the big question affecting every single department this year is obviously COVID-19. I mean, I would imagine that given the unusual challenges and jobs that the armed forces have to do, and also the kind of living conditions, units operating in close quarters and so on, I imagine it's been quite challenging, but in different ways to other parts of the state. How are the armed forces handling the pandemic?
Well, first of all, the men and women have done a fantastic job in responding to COVID right from the start, even actually before the sort of mass infection started to hit. The MOD did what it does best. You know, defence is about resilience. It's about moving at pace. It's about actually command and control and planning and logistics. That's what actually a large proportion of our officers are trained to do. So for us, in a sense, it's been just a much larger scale of things we've sort of done before. It's been unique in some areas, getting more engaged in something like the NHS logistical chain, or indeed going into more departments than we would normally. So suddenly finding military planners in the Department of Health, in NHS England, in MHCLG, Department of Transport, right across government. I think we've been broader and more numbers. We had at one stage 20,000 people on the COVID contingency force, and on any one day about 4,000 of those people were deployed. But in one stage it's been, you know, it's our bread and butter. We do resilience. Quite early on, it was that we were able to say to our leaders, right, you go and plan for the next stage and your deputies can get on and run the day-to-day. Quite early on, I took the decision to devolve my authority. I didn't centralise it, which is often a trait of government. I said to all my regional commanders, you have my authorities to trigger and authorise military support. Normally, on a normal day, it comes through the bureaucracy onto my desk, and, you know, these things are slow. And I just said, that's ridiculous. Handed it off, actually. In fact, the last sort of MACA I organised, which was a military aid civilian authority, the last authorisation I did of that was probably nothing to do with COVID and probably something to do with a bomb threat or something. So normally, you know, we've held it centrally, but we devolved. We went on our front foot in command and control and used all our assets to deliver a response. So they've done really, really well. They're still thinking. We're busy planning for Brexit Day, busy planning for second wave, busy planning for, you know, floods and all the other stuff. So it's been full on, but it's also been what we're trained for.
And the armed forces are now brought in the new phase of the kind of reaction with the autumn beginning to possible uptick of COVID. We obviously heard from Downing Street recently that the armed forces can be brought in other capacities to support the police. Yeah,
I mean, look, the point is we are can do. We can do lots of things. The government were worried about enforcement and the lack of people in some parts of the country taking the threat seriously, and realised that enforcement has got to be stepped up. Now, our role in that was not to deploy soldiers on streets. That's not our job. Our job is to allow the police to go to their front line if they're doing back office jobs. So we have explored. As we speak right now, we haven't had a request to actually do it, but we were asked to explore and plan to see if we could relieve some policemen so they could go on the front line. Doesn't take much work. We do that for terrorism already. We have a 3,000 contingency force on any one stage ready to go should there be those awful attacks 2017 and we need to release more police to do investigations. So again, an example, as I said earlier, it's sort of what we do It's just matching it to the threat or the problem of the day.
I should say at this point that we're, due to your very busy schedule, we're recording this a few days before the Conservative conference, hence the number 10 announcements in the very recent past. They're obviously a little bit further on when the conference itself comes round. You mentioned the way in which this year you've seen military planners and logistics organisers, and in some cases troops and so on, helping out different departments in ways that perhaps haven't happened in the past. From a Defence Secretary's perspective, in a very different department to quite a lot of the others, do you think that helps you with a spending review on the horizon, with the budget that always been postponed, budget questions, talking to colleagues? Is this must be another string to your bow?
I've just come from a meeting with number 10 on exactly that. Well, I hope it is. I mean, look, we're in the middle of an economy that has effectively gone on pause because of COVID. We've seen massive decline in economic growth and huge spending obligations effectively on the government, whether that's benefits, whether that's furlough schemes, and all the things that the Chancellor is trying to do to stimulate the economy again. And so all our departments have asks, and that's going to be a challenge. It is a matter of public record that we've inherited a black hole in defence of £13 billion, which needs to be found in the next 4 years. That's National Audit Office figure, and that's something that we're going to have to see what we can do to deal with. But I think there are ways to deliver, and my conversations with the Prime Minister have been very positive. Like any stage of the cycle, the negotiations now start, and I don't know where we'll end up. I don't know where in the next few weeks we'll get to, but I'll be making the case for the armed forces. I'll be making a case that the Conservative Party is always a great supporter of the armed forces, and that we have been providing the resilience of society in the last 6-7 months. We have been one of the main pillars, and also in the meantime, our adversaries around the world, whether that is Russia or the competition we get from China or Iran, are more active than they've been. We only saw the other day Russia poisoning Navalny, and the allegations from Germany and others that this was using Novichok again. All of that means that we have threat growing, unstable world, and pandemic, and there is a strong role for the military that needs to be invested in. And I know the Prime Minister agrees with me. How much is what we'll negotiate?
And it's in that context, I'll bring in the first question from one of our audience. This is from Graham Bunker, appropriately surnamed, for the topic. He says,
"Hope he's not in the bunker."
Indeed. Why, as we set out into a new international relationship, are you not advocating an increase in defence spending to 3% by the end of the Parliament?
Well, let's see where we get to in this. I mean, I think the trajectory has been up. I got a record sum last year of 2.2 billion from the Prime Minister, which was a good result for us. I don't think we were not on track to get that. The trajectory is growing. How far it grows, we'll see. And I think what I'm really keen for is, as long as I've been involved both as a soldier but also in government, strategic defence reviews have been numbered by two things. They've been characterised by two things. One is a numbers game. How big is the infantry going to be? How big is, how many are you going to have? And also it's been a sort of characteristic of, equipment bingo, as I call it. We've got to have these tanks, we've got to have these aircraft, and also sort of the GDP point number that you talk about. Let's remember, GDP has shrunk. So it's not necessarily in defence's interest to be permanently tagged to GDP if you get into a current economic state that we're in. I mean, that could mean a negative impact on our finances. So I think what should really guide us is the threat and our foreign policy ambition. Those two things together should define what we want in defence. Do we want to be projecting power? Do we want to project influence? Do we want to take the fight to our enemies? Or do we want to focus on the homeland? Do we want to be more reliable on the United States or more interoperable but independent when we need to be? All of those things should shape what our defence budget should be.
Well, you've anticipated to a certain extent what my next question was going to be. No, it's quite all right. It's a very good thing to do. Always helpful for an interviewer. And when you've got that GDP kind of percentage tag, which has done the rounds, obviously carries an awful lot of weight for treaty reasons as well as historical reasons, and the economy shrinks by an unprecedented amount, and of course for a few months, it's obviously encouraging to hear that you speak to Number 10 and they are supportive in terms of and recognise the work that you can do in terms of their supporting their strategic goals. Quite a lot of this comes down to Number 11, though, doesn't it, in terms of what kind of attitude the Treasury takes, whether they want to be kind of dogmatic about pointing to a shrinking the same share of a shrinking economy becomes less money, or whether, as one of our other listeners raises, would you be open, given the dire state of public finances, to the idea of transferring nuclear deterrent costs, for example, from the MOD to the Treasury? I mean, what kind of reception do you get from the Chancellor?
I'd be open to moving costs to everybody else. I mean, look. The realities are we have to live with. First of all, is the economy as is. We are Conservatives. We are going to have to do our very best to make sure that there is a state of public finances afterwards that we can all live with. I mean, we will face the consequences of this COVID for decades to come in our debt and everything else, and we need to make sure that we can be front of the queue picking ourselves up in the economy, and that is a really tough call. Now, of course, as Defence Secretary, I'd say, we're a very productive part of government. Our productivity is very good. The wages of our armed forces are not spectacularly high. The work ethos, the work rate you get out of them, the productivity, plus they also are prepared to take risk that, people die in, and they keep us safe. And therefore, if you're going to put more money out, you should put it in me and my department because we're more productive. And there are a lot of other people historically who you could argue that, other departments or other services in the public sector are not as productive as the armed forces. So there's always a productivity argument is one of the things to make to a Chancellor, but he's got a very difficult, but I wouldn't like to be the Chancellor in this situation. I'll make the case. Threat is always a difficult thing to predict. I know from being the Security Minister for over 3 years that, you take risk. I mean, nothing is certain in the world of security and defence. So if you don't want to invest in something now, we might never use it. A lot of the stuff we buy, we do never use. But I can tell you now that you don't want to be beaten when you have to use something. So I think that's the argument to make. And we want to modernise. We definitely need to modernise the armed forces. And in doing that, we'll need some money. So those will be the pitches. I don't envy the Chancellor. He has a balance to make. I'll be making a case for us. And we'll see. I think we're in the end game between now and sort of end of October will be the big time where we're going to make these crunchy decisions.
You mentioned earlier that obviously the way you would start off, your starting point in this would be to assess what the threat is and define the threat, establish the needs to protect against that threat or prepare to manage various risks, and then work out what provision you need to back that up. But obviously the requirements of the national debt and the deficit that you've just mentioned, the requirements of good fiscal management mean that isn't always going to be possible. That's where the strategic review comes in. So I suppose my first question about the strategic review is, what do you think the last strategic review got wrong or missed completely?
I think the last one and the one before that, and I think probably the one before that, the first thing they all got wrong was they didn't fund it. They didn't match what it said in the document with a funding stream that was realistic. So in our fund, in the 2015 one, it had pretty much fancy levels of efficiency savings and then spending commitments from the efficiency savings before they were realised. So I think it was, my memory serves me right, I think we were going to have £11 billion in efficiency savings and then spend £7 billion on equipment. Neither of which came in either on budget or indeed matched the efficiency savings. And at the same time, you have governments like in 2010 whose global ambitions weren't matched by the funding behind it. So I think in the past they were underfunded and overambitious, or both. And then because defence's equipment programs are often 20 years, the F-35 fighter that we are starting to take delivery of. That's been in the pipeline 22 years. You know, the aircraft carriers were first announced in 1998, and you know they will become the first one. She becomes operational, Queen Elizabeth, at the end of the year. So these are big, long-term programs, and unless secretaries of state and unless government keeps a very, very beady eye on budget lines, there's all sorts of things that can grow or indeed be snuck in later along the lines that somebody else pays for. So the other thing that I think people got wrong was they didn't look at the whole process when it came to working out their budgets. And as a result, things bite you in the backside. And that's partly where we are now. Do
you get advice from some of your predecessors who've gone through those previous strategic reviews and they encountered some of those other kind of man traps hiding in the undergrowth sometimes around? Do they kind of...
Some of them do, but some of them are also the problem. I mean, some definitely have been very helpful, but if I look at the last 30, 40 years, and so I mean, we're not just talking about, I'm not talking about 2015, let's say anymore 2010. I'm talking, earlier than that. And some of this problem is 20, 30 years old. I mean, this goes back. When you've got programs that are 22 years of age, once they're signed and contracted, it's pretty hard for someone to turn that oil tank around. And the liabilities are massive. So I think what I would say has been, my analysis of the problem has been, too many in the past politicians who want to enjoy the icing on the cake without funding the cake. There's been lots of global ambition and, we can do this, we can do that, and trying to get that on the cheap. There has been a few military leaders who have, probably put in optimism bias that, something doesn't really cost that much, or it's going to be, it comes with a price tag. And of course, when you look in detail, the through life support costs or the software updates or the weapon system updates that will inevitably happen over 20 years are not put up front. So it's a bit like I was saying to the Prime Minister, actually, it's a bit like when you go to a car showroom and you see a car you really like and the salesman saying, well, yeah, you can buy it for that amount. But if you want, a radio and some electric windows and actually some wheels, it will cost you extra. And when you say, well, I don't really think I can afford it, they very kindly say, but we do finance. And then there's a massive balloon payment at the end. I mean, that is a lot of these equipment programs, if you're not really, really thorough, can turn out to be like that. And so I think what my predecessors will say is that predominant tension of underfunding, over-ambition by their prime ministers or their senators is what brings this home to roost.
And in terms of that longer view, as you say, when you're talking about strategic review and you're looking forward to decisions which apply to decades in the future, but also in some cases take decades to implement, how do we, thinking about things like the end of transition, Brexit, leaving the European Union, how does that affect defence and MOD thinking? I'm thinking, for example, when you hear voices from the EU Commission talk about the 21st century as an age of empires in which one must choose one empire or another. Where does post-Brexit UK fit into that in defence terms? I
think the plus side is when it comes to defence and security, there are only so many doers in the world. And, Europe can talk about defence all its likes, but actually there are only a few countries in Europe who actually do things with their defence budget and do things with like-minded allies. And so I think international, Britain's position post-Brexit is we're great enablers, great defence conveners. Our aircraft carrier will be an amazing convener. If we want to go and uphold the freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, which all of the European countries agree with, then funnily enough, when our carrier group goes there one day, and we hope to go on our own entirely, but we can take partners. We can take the Dutch or the Danish or whoever wanted to support that international rule of law issue. We can convene the Caribbean. We can convene the United States. Right now, a US squadron, Marine Squadron F-35 fighters are on the Queen Elizabeth training together. So we can be conveners. We have key edges in our Five Eyes partnerships and intelligence. And intelligence is like the honey. The bees go to the honey when it comes to finding out the next conflicts, and we can pick and choose our battles, and I think that's going to be quite important. How does Britain uphold its interests in the world? We can pick our partners, pick our battles, and also, I'm determined in this integrated review that we have the ability, if we wish to do things more on our own. Because at the moment we have gone beyond interoperability, that is where we can communicate and work with each other's nations, to sometimes being too dependent on certain capabilities that mean even if we need to go somewhere, unless we get the support of another country, we can't do it.
How do you go about, in terms of interoperability, but also maintaining your independence of operation? When you're talking about looking at things in years and decades, you're talking about the fact that some countries are doers and some are not. How do you go about making sure that you can remain interoperable with the countries you foresee you will need to keep working with, while maintaining that independence? How do you strike that balance?
Well, so one of the great benefits of NATO is, a large part of what NATO does is NATO standards, common data standards, common encryption standards, common interoperability standards. And so actually it's a great manual of, what you need to be able to do if you want to work with each other. So NATO is really useful in lots of ways, but that is one of the most useful ways. Now, that doesn't obviously cover Australia and Japan and other countries in the Far East, but it definitely covers most of Europe, the United States, and as a result, it becomes quite a dominant set of standards in the West when it comes to aerospace manufacturers and working together. And that's quite important. Now, of course, within those standards, you can see big multinationals, corporations are very clever at getting you hooked on one element of capability, and the next thing you know, every time you want to upgrade your missile or your launcher, you have to keep buying that. It's a bit like Apple. If you want to use all the Apple gadgets, you usually have to keep buying Apple, and so that's what you have to be careful of. And sometimes the technology is so important that you just go with it anyhow, because that it's the best, and it will be the best for the next 20, 30 years. So there's always a trade-off, but you can do it. And the thing nowadays is to work out what you can let go of more. So if you have common data standards, you have more of open architecture in your systems, then people can plug and play, and you'll be looking for solutions that way. So it's important, but it's also really important that we buy physical hardware that allows us to plug and play and pick our friends.
And in terms of the type of project or the type of commissioning, when you were saying just now, some things, they're sufficiently complex or advanced, you kind of need to go with them. Obviously, historically, there have been things to deal with, particularly extreme scenarios. So, ballistic missiles and hypersonics and that kind of thing, which are extreme scenarios and more complex projects. Does that effectively continue, or are there bits of that that apply?
I think some of that will definitely continue. But I think, like Raytheon, who's obviously sponsoring today, Raytheon, there are a number of missile makers in the West. There aren't that many, and it's quite a competitive field. But, Raytheon, like all the other missile manufacturers, have worked out that their success is about being able to sell in volume to a range of platforms. So, the F-35, which is a multinational fighter project led by Lockheed Martin, the US defense prime. Britain is the only tier one partner with BAE. It's in Raytheon and other manufacturers' interest to be as generic as possible, because, it'll always catch up with you. So let's say you make a missile that's not generic. Eventually, you'll be beaten by a platform that's not generic. So someone will come along and build an aircraft where the rules prevent you putting those missiles on. So it's in everybody's interest. It's a bit like a free market. It's in everybody's interest to not be protectionist. But that's what you have to be alert to when you're doing the future planning.
And in terms of some of the partners we're looking at in the future, is Brexit an opportunity for, say, the UK-US relationship in defence terms and technology terms to become closer? Or is it something you look broader? I think, for example, say Matt Kilcoyne, another of our viewers from the Alan Smith Institute, asks about whether the UK would acknowledge the growing risk of China to allies in the Far East by committing to, for example, an alliance with Kanzuk states plus Japan plus Korea, who you just mentioned. How does that mix fit together?
So first of all, we would absolutely continue to explore more working with new partners in Asia and deepening our Five Eyes. That is, New Zealand and Australia are obviously over there, and mutual help and mutual signalling about standing by each other is really, really important for us in sending a message to China. I would absolutely consider doing more with it, and in fact, we are already working around some of those sort of Asia groupings that allow international observers or indeed partner status. So we will be doing more of that. That's really the best way we can do it. And then when it comes to aerospace, of course there is lots of opportunities. British companies sell abroad to Asia all the time. There's definitely more markets that we can grow there, or we can partner. So the Type 26, the British next generation of anti-submarine frigate, is originally designed in the United Kingdom, being built in the United Kingdom. We've sold that design to both Canada and Australia. So while it won't be made in Britain, it will be made in Australia. The design and the project, what goes on it and all those different systems will be a collaborative approach. And that will be good for British business, and it will be good for Australia business. And that sort of is, I think, a really good way to proceed as well.
And will that affect commissioning, presumably, when we're talking about Brexit, for example, building things and commissioning them no longer subject to EU commissioning rules, presumably on that basis, which does that simplify or make more complex the balance between kind of buy British or build or buy abroad?
It's never really been a problem in defence, because we're not part of the overall sort of EU competition rules in the same way. Defence was always slightly carved out. And for example, if I make the case for something being a warship, for example, it gives me more freedom of manoeuvre, as long as it's based on the thing actually being a warship, to make all sorts of choices around design, around location of build, around sovereign components. All of that can come into play. So we've never really had the same challenge as if we were, the Department of Transport commissioning navigation ships or fisheries protection vessels. That's been very different. So for us, we've sort of been okay. The real consideration in British aerospace is always about sovereign capability. How much do you want to have the sole control over certain key capabilities? Traded off against, how much do I want my men and women of the armed forces to have the very best we can afford? Because they're not always the same. I've been a soldier, and I remember being quite envious of some other armies' kit, right? Because it was much better, in some occasions. But other stuff, some of our kit was the best in the world. And so you have to, when you're a user, you're under fire or someone's threatening you, you don't really want to, in that split second, to be having a debate. You want a battle-winning capability. The way for us to continue to be battle-winning British is R&D budgets, is to invest massively in R&D. And defence is one of the biggest R&D investors. We're going to do more of it. I plan to do more in the IR, a lot more. That's how you really keep yourself being best, not by protectionism, but by investing in the brains and the capability and making sure you lead the world, because you are investing in that research right from the conceptual stage. And that's what we're going to do more of.
Does that come into the internal negotiations on spending in the government? When you're saying that, obviously you can say to the Treasury, well, if there are multipliers, financial multipliers based on the MOD's budget, is what proportion of it's spent in the UK, how much of it goes to UK manufacturers, R&D, and so on, compared to how much, as you say, you might be able to buy more stuff, or in some cases, better stuff elsewhere.
I think that's an argument that you use with number 10. I think number 10 are very alert to the impact of R&D. The politics of growing your skills base is incredibly important to number 10. It's also, it's what a Secretary of State does, which is, you come together, I'll work with BEIS and Department of Education to build a lobby to say to the Treasury, there is a skill-based issue here. This is sometimes even more important than a tax, policy discussion is, look, I've always felt, I represent Preston, North and Wire in Lancashire. We've got lots of aerospace workers. The skills capability is often more important to a business than the tax regime it lives under. If you don't have skills, it's like not having oxygen. You just keel over and those businesses will move. And for British sovereign capability, we can't go and import a whole load of people. We have to invest in our workforce. And it's no coincidence that aerospace is the biggest apprenticeship investor in the United Kingdom, whether that's BAE or probably Raytheon and others. They invest in apprenticeships because they need British sovereign skills.
You were talking earlier about the importance of NATO, of course, and NATO standards and so on. Do the internal tensions currently visible in NATO trouble you when we're looking at the strategic outlook? I think, for example, in the Mediterranean between Greece and Turkey, or even what the Greek and Turkish governments have had to say about the upsurge of fighting in Nagorno-Karabakh, where each has some interests, if not direct participation.
Yeah, I mean, no one wants a NATO, which is a unanimous decision-making body, for tensions to exist. Of course, there's always differences. I worry in the short term. I don't worry in the long term, because the thing that binds us together is not only a sense of a strategic threat from Russia, a sense that Russia's activity is malign and increasing, and it no one disputes that. Whether you're French or Turkish or Greeks, they all will agree that Russia's malign activity is in the wrong, is bad and going in the wrong direction. They will all agree that we need to stick together to counter that. I think what to me is more important in the long term is, however, does NATO modernize when it comes to discussing how it deals with the threat? NATO is still quite focused on tank brigades, air squadrons and ships in almost a Cold War type description of how we counter our adversaries, as if mass on its own is somehow the solution. And our adversaries have already traded mass and mobilization, or mass and mobility, to speed and readiness. So Russia, for example, spends a lot of its time being very ready by constantly exercising. And then, as we saw in Ukraine in 2014, I think it was literally from an exercise, they ran into an invasion. They keep moving, and they keep us guessing, and they keep that. And that's how we have to think more about what we're going to do. I mean, it's not just about sitting in a static bunch of armor brigades just waiting, almost like you're a modern Maginot Line, waiting for somehow this great force to come out of the trees, when in fact they've gone round you. That's what I hope NATO, and there's a modernization program going on at the moment, does that, recognizes that that's why we need to change.
So that question of avoiding that Maginot Line risk feeds into something which has caused a huge amount of controversy recently. What is the mix in the strategic outlook between traditional assets, kind of heavy machinery-based assets, cyber, space as a new kind of warfighting field? How does that mixture fit together in your mind?
Well, it's a real challenge, because the thing that's really emerged in the last 10 years is proliferation of capabilities that used to belong either to effectively a tier one type country. Encryption used to belong really in the realms of very few powerful, modern defense capability countries. So, or some of the anti-armor capabilities, or UAVs, they were in America, China, and Russia, and Britain, and a few of the others, but not across the board. And what we've now seen is proliferation of technologies, both from a state to a non-peer state, but also to terrorism. Terrorists now use encryption. Not only encryption, they use end-to-end encryption. Terrorists now have access to UAVs that they have successfully used in Syria and Iraq to target security forces. We find in the hands of, likes of Iran, weapon systems that would have been quite sophisticated and certainly could certainly defeat quite a lot of capability held by the West, now have been proliferated from other countries, shall we say. All of that means that the battlefield is a very dangerous place, and that countries like the United Kingdom has a real challenge in dealing with everything from an adversary, a peer-to-peer threat, all the way through to a non-peer threat. And that means two things have to happen. First, we have to look across other domains in order to try and get effect before we have to get into a battle. So avoid a conflict developing. If we can use cyber and information operations, or indeed training and assistance, sort of resilience of those host nations to prevent them tipping over into chaos or into being unduly influenced by an adversary, then we should work sub-threshold. We should do much more of that, below armed conflict. And the best way to stop a conflict happening is to get engaged to prevent it. Doesn't mean to say you stay neutral, it just means you shore them up. There are countries in Africa that if we help train their armed forces, we help them with cyber defense, we help them with sort of anti-corruption and issues like that, then it makes that country less vulnerable to other countries that would come and use their money or their weapons or indeed proxies, terrorists, to undermine them. And I think that's where a lot of our future defence is going to be. And we have to stitch it together. And that may be, in some areas, that's traditional, that is conventional, using, mass, using armour, using a more conventional type of warfare, all the way through to unconventional, more special forces, more unconventional use of cyber, or offensive cyber as an option, or indeed use power projection, use the carrier group to be more than just an airfield. The carrier group is going to be about intelligence, it's going to be about protection, it's about surveillance and reconnaissance, and providing that convening power for lots of small partners to come together to make a big force. And I think that's how I see the future threat being met. A combination of burden sharing, new domains, operating below the threshold of war to make sure we avoid the war in the first place.
When we're discussing things like cyber and information operations, that's obviously a technological development. There's technological assets that are needed, but there's a skills and people element to that too. A new generation of skills, a new generation of soldiers, and therefore a question of the military, something bound up with an awful lot of tradition, quite a lot of purposes, as well as elements of history, which one could imagine be quite controversial in a more woke generation of younger people. Do you anticipate that's going to be a problem? Is that an issue in terms of...
No shortage of that. To be fair, GCHQ have sort of led the way with the National Cyber Security Centre. People recognise that if they want to stay safe online in the civilian world, then cyber is part of, is a growing industry. And whether that's for defence or whether that's for security or whether that's for trade, all of that, I think means there's a whole generation of young people who want that to be their future, cyber. And then if you add that to the fact that I've just not so long ago signed off a cyber pay spine. I've now got a completely separate, within the armed forces, a cyber pay spine. You can go up it, you get your promotions up it, and you can be a specialist in cyber in the same way you could be a specialist in medical or other disciplines. Shows that there is not only a need for it, but also people are engaging with it. And we've had no shortage of people wanting to do that well. And
one final question I think we have time for. Thank you for being generous with your time.
It's because you're a Wallace, Mark.
Exactly. I think I did that. Excellent choice of surname, which I can only praise. But one final question, it'd be remiss of me not to ask about this, I think, is that when you mentioned earlier that you yourself have been a soldier, you've been there at the kind of coalface of the armed forces, dealing with the good and the bad that the MOD might decide to do in terms of commissioning or policy and strategy and so on. You can hear your own passion on that topic when you were talking about it earlier. And indeed, you could see it in the discussions over things like the Overseas Operations Bill. One thing that came out in that debate, as you'll recall, was your own mention of Labour's wars being illegal. That I think was described by the government as being a personal view. Is some of that rooted in your experience as a soldier, your kind of understanding and your insight into what it's like for people who actually fight wars rather than talk about them?
So first of all, what angered me about Labour at that debate is I spent too much time, both on this job and in the last job, signing checks for compensation for where their government had instructed people to do things that turned out in court to be unlawful. You know, I find it a complete cheek that they were standing at dispatch box telling us that it was, you know, we didn't need this bill should be paused. And, you know, the amount of money, of taxpayers' money that has gone to compensate people, some of whom really should not be compensated. But nevertheless, we were found in court, you know, the government of the day to have done something wrong. And I happened to be filling that job as the minister when the courts make their decision, is very frustrating. But also, it is a reflection that my responsibility and a politician's responsibility, whether they've served or not, is to uphold, it's for us to help our soldiers uphold those standards by making sure that when we send them to war, we give them a legal footing for them to do that. And I think that's really, really important, because that's how they can be free to do their job, which is very difficult. I don't want them to come back and suddenly find they're investigated. I don't want them to be able to have come back and get slapped with a court order. And so I remember when I was in Northern Ireland, where there would be lots of scenarios about when you could open fire, not open fire. And there were often split-second decisions. And when the only force you have at your disposal is a gun, so it's not like a middle way where you can select, oh, I'll have a taser in this split second instead of a gun, or I'll push someone over rather than shoot. In that split second, you can find yourself being tried for excessive force, whether it's the only force you have or not. And I just think it is a decision we put on our troops. It's very, very hard for many of them, especially when you get into non-sort of conventional war. You know, everyone knew who the Germans were. It was a proper war, you know, in the Second World War. We put more and more young men and women in counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations, and we need it to get it right. We own the duty to get it right. And if we get something wrong, we should say so. I am very confident because I check it and I make sure I know the details of it. That every military action I've authorised in this job is legal, is in line with international law, and means that, you know, a Secretary of State sitting in this chair in 10 years' time won't be signing checks, and the men and women that are doing the stuff that I've authorised are not hauled up and for them to endless investigations. I'm passionate about getting that right. If we want to change the law, we can have a discussion about changing laws, and if we want to ensure international treaties are modern and reflect the modern nature of global warfare in certain areas, then we need to be doing that. But what I won't have is a lecture from the Labour Party as we all sit here and many men and women had to deal with of mopping up a mess if they didn't follow the rules. Our deployments in Afghanistan, our deployments in Syria, our deployments in Iraq are all in accordance right now with international law, with collective self-defence or imminent threat against us. And that's our responsibility. And this government believes in the rule of law and will follow that.
And on that note, Ben Wallace, Secretary of State for Defence, it only falls to me to say from ConservativeHome in partnership with Raytheon UK and from all of our listeners around the country and around the world, thank you very much for your time, your insight. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your questions, and I hope you'll join us for the next event in our programme shortly.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you. Bye-bye.